live debate. intelligencesquared.com.
Steve, thank you for that extraordinary tour de force. In a weird and unconscious way, I've been shadowing you throughout your career. When I wrote The Red Queen about evolutionary psychology, you wrote The Language Instinct. When you wrote The Blank Slate, I wrote Nature via Nurture, both about human nature. And now I've written The Rational Optimist, and you've written The Better Angels of Our Nature. Not that I'm trying to pretend my books are as good as yours. If any of you have seen the play Amadeus, I am Salieri. I would love to write books as well as you do. I'm not Salieri in the sense that I want to have you killed, because, yet anyway. But I'd just like to say that at the end of 696 pages of The Better Angels of Our Nature, I didn't want it to end. Thank you for that. But let me start, though, with a point that you raise in passing, which is that concerned colleagues in academia sidled up to you while you were writing this book, knowing that you were doing so, to educate you about Norman Angell. Yes. Now, Norman Angell was the man who basically said, or is alleged to have said, that war, this was before the First World War, that war was now impossible because of all the trading that was going on between countries. Now, not only is that actually a wrong version of what Norman Angell said, but in a sense, he was right. You talk about trade.
Yes, indeed, and he was, and indeed, a number of colleagues have kind of put their arm around me, pulled me aside in order to protect myself against the impending humiliation of going down in history as another Norman Angell. But in fact, as Matt mentioned, Norman Angell didn't predict that war was impossible or obsolete, only that it was economically irrational. That with a change from agriculture and reliance on extractive technologies like mining to greater creation of wealth through division of labor, through instruments of large-scale cooperation, there is nothing to be gained financially by invading a territory. It's not as if the gold pops out of the ground. You still need an infrastructure to develop it and make it into something useful. And so it would be any country seeking to enrich itself would be better off buying what it wants than stealing it. It would be cheaper. But he was, if you agree with this interpretation of Angell, I think he was misinterpreted as saying that war couldn't happen. In fact, he explicitly noted that economic incentives are not the only incentives for war. In fact, that a lot of wars are fought over national glory and rectifying historic injustices and grandeur and honor and so on. And in fact, he was terrified that the leaders of nations at the time would blunder into a war in pursuit of these non-material incentives like glory and honor. And in fact, he proved to be correct both in his fear and in his prediction, namely that the more recent studies have shown that indeed two countries that trade with each other have a lower chance of getting embroiled in a war.
And this has resonance today because just in the last couple of weeks we've had the German Chancellor saying that if the economics goes bad, if trade collapses effectively in the Eurozone, then the risk of war increases. It's not just that, though. The theory of gentle commerce, which you discussed a minute ago, also kind of applies on the level of the individual. That essentially what people like Jonathan Haidt and others have argued is that individualism, autonomy, contract, things like this have actually been pacifiers, whereas community, tribalism, hierarchy, tradition have been the opposite. That's exactly the opposite of what, for example, most Christianity teaches. They think that capitalism is making us coarser and more violent.
Yes, indeed, and also a common misconception is that what pulls us away from violence is our own moral self, our conscience, our moral intuitions. And Haidt notes, he doesn't draw out the implications as clearly as he should, that the human moral sense by default includes a lot of intuitions that we in the modern West don't recognize as particularly moral, such as deference to authority, such as conformity to community norms, such as keeping the soul pure and not contaminating it with prohibited foods or sexual practices. The problem is that a violation of any of these moral intuitions is deemed punishable. And so you have a long list of sins, such as insolence, nonconformity, that we feel not only justified in punishing, but that it's mandatory to punish them. As the moral sense gets purified to just fairness and the avoidance of harm, which has been the trend in moral deliberation in the West, there are fewer and fewer rationales for punishing someone. So you don't throw a gay person in jail, you don't stone the adulteress, you don't imprison someone who criticizes the king. And the remaining moral intuitions, basically fairness, reciprocity, are what undermine trade and exchange, and in general they are a less violent way of organizing our lives than the punishment of heinous sins.
And related to that, here's a provocative remark that I found in your book. Religion as a force for peace does not fit the facts of history.
Yes.
17th century wars were bloodier and longer because of religion. Ideology is one of the inner demons. Do you expect to win that argument?
Well, I think that the argument has some facts behind it, that in the list of history's worst atrocities, there are a number that were sparked by religious ideologies: the Crusades, the European Wars of Religion, the Taiping Rebellion in China, the history's worst civil war, which began from a messianic cult. This is not to say that as Christopher Hitchens put it in the subtitle of his book, that religion poisons everything. That's definitely an overstatement. And there have been non-religious ideologies that similarly hold out the prospect of a utopia, that also have led to some of the outliers in the distribution of bloodshed. Matthew White, whose figures I rely on, notes in his book that a friend of his once mused aloud, I wonder how much misery and suffering and death can be attributed to religion. And he said 10%. Because he actually had the figures of all of the atrocities in history, and about 10% of the deaths came from religious conflicts.
For every moral advance in history, you write, there have been social commentators who insist we have never had it so bad. Why? And then they go on to argue, and I get this too, why draw attention to the decline? You'll only cut off our funds. Competitive doom-mongering is quite a profitable business these days. Are you raining on their parade?
Yes. Wasn't there an old anarchist saying, the worse the better? Yes, I think there are a number of reasons that people concentrate on the worst. One of them is simple availability. And cognitive psychologists such as Daniel Kahneman have shown that people estimate risk and danger by recalling examples, the availability heuristic, and anything that affects human memory, such as an event that was recent, an event that was large in magnitude, an event that was gory, unusual, distinctive, will tend to inflate people's subjective assessment of the probabilities. Now that we have media that can report anything bad happening anywhere on Earth in real time, I mean, the extreme form is now anyone with a cell phone, which is a large proportion of humanity, is now an on-the-scene newscaster and can literally broadcast color footage of bloodshed in real time from anywhere in the world. This is bound to, and so since violence has by no means been eliminated, there's always enough of it to fill the evening news, and so we can get an impression that nothing has changed. It's because all of the trouble spots in the world where violence hasn't broken out recently, where people die of proverbial old age. They don't have camera crews filming those deaths. And so our subjective impressions can be out of touch with the statistics. The other reason is that there is a moralistic element to it, namely the way you apply pressure is to emphasize how bad things are, and there's a fear that if people think that life is getting better, they'll interpret it as a signal that we can relax, which is wrong in two ways. One of them is clearly there's still a lot more violence that we can and ought to get rid of, and it's been indeed the pressure to lower it in the past that has delivered some of the reductions in violence that we enjoy today. But also, I tend to think that there's a complementary danger. That is, if people just think that we're doomed, and it doesn't matter what we do, and Africa is just a hellhole, they're always going to be fighting, the best thing we could do is maybe recolonize them, which is a comment that you often see, then that can lead to inaction or worse. But I believe that if you show people, here are the graphs, things really have been getting better, we have been doing something right, let's figure out what it is, bottle it, concentrate it, do more of it, then that's actually will lead to better outcomes in the future than if you simply convince people that everything is terrible and always will be.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of use this session actually as a bit of a sort of psychotherapy session for me, because I've gone through quite a lot of these objections, obviously, having written a similar book, and so I'm curious to know how you answer some of the questions I get. When you're accused of being Whiggish, yes, you know, you're like Thomas Babington Macaulay. You're back to saying there is an arrow of progress. You're enlightenment. You're not relativism. How do you respond?
Yes. Well, I don't think it's Whig history to measure something and look at a graph and see that objectively it's really been getting better. That's just a fact. It's not Whig history. It's undoubtedly true that we've been getting taller, we've been living longer, we know more, and we're less likely to get murdered or to die in a war and a genocide. Now, if that's Whig history, then that's really just history. That's just respectfully trying to get as accurate a picture as you can of the state of the world and reporting what you find. To the extent that it does tend to lead to discovery of processes that we want to explain, namely, it does seem to be, can't be a coincidence that homicides have gone down, but also slavery and also human sacrifice and also debtors' prisons. And hey, what do you know? Rates of death in warfare have been going down more recently. If you have a lot of graphs that seem to be going in the same direction, from the top left to the bottom right, then that's an empirical puzzle that needs an explanation. And if there are general forces that seem to push many disparate phenomena in the same direction, that is a discovery that you make that the world is telling you about. It's not an attitude, a philosophy, an ideology, an a priori commitment.
One of the impressions one might get of your book, if you read too many of the reviews, is that it's mostly about statistics. Now, sure, as we've seen, there is a lot of statistics in there, but some of the reviewers obviously didn't get to the second half of the book, because there is a fabulous exploration of psychology and some wonderful descriptions of experiments that actually sort of change the way you understand things, really drilling down into the neuroscience as well. So this isn't just a book, a catalogue book. This is really a book of exposition and understanding. But one of the curious things about it is that you are one of the founders of the School of Evolutionary Psychology, whose kind of motto might be, if you were being unkind, you can't change human nature. And yet, here you are saying something pretty dramatic about human nature has changed. What's changed if human nature hasn't changed?
Yeah, and I do discuss in the book the possibility that human nature has literally changed in the sense of Darwinian natural selection operating to change gene frequencies over spans of centuries and millennia, which is possible, but it's not the explanation that I rely on, just on grounds of scientific parsimony, since some of the declines are too recent to have occurred through natural selection. Natural selection has a speed limit measured in generations, and some of these declines have unfolded over decades. We know that some forces can bring violence down without any change in the genome. Therefore, the most parsimonious explanation is that none of them required this. But it is an open hypothesis. So I do believe that there is such a thing as human nature, but I believe that some of the parts of human nature are open-ended, combinatorial, generative, rule-governed systems, cognition and language in particular. Once you have an apparatus that can combine thoughts into more complicated thoughts and combine the complicated ones into still more complicated ones, and there's an exact analogy to the way words combine into phrases and phrases combine into bigger phrases, and not a coincidence because the language is there to express the ideas. But what it means is one component of human nature is an engine to come up with new ideas, to explore the space of possible ideas, which means that a fixed human nature can come up with an infinite range of ideas. And if the social world is set up with rules so that as ideas are exchanged, the better ones are preserved and built upon, and the worst ones are discarded, namely the social institutions of deliberative democracy, open journalism, freedom of speech, scientific peer review, and so on. There's no contradiction in saying that a human mind a set of human minds operating under those rules will explore the space of ideas and eventually blunder upon those that really make us all better off. When it happens in the world of fact, we call it science and history. When it comes to the world of policy, we call it politics and society. And so that's why I don't think there's any contradiction between a belief in human nature and a belief in progress.
Yeah, essentially, the argument is that culture is cumulative, that ideas can accumulate, good ideas can accumulate within culture, and you and I can therefore draw upon good ideas that have been worked out by people in distant places and distant times that weren't available before because we're getting them through trade and exchange and ideas.
As long as you have certain ground rules, like you're not allowed to murder people who disagree with you.